Thank you for joining us for today's webinar hosted by LawRoom entitled More Than a Pipeline Problem, Exploring Gender Disparities in the Tech Industry. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce myself and our moderator. My name is Tanya Fabianic. I'm an account executive here at LawRoom, and I work with tech companies in California and around the country to deploy wide-scale employee training initiatives around diversity, discrimination, harassment, as well as data security, among other key employee conduct training courses. LawRoom has trained over 1.5 million employees and students across the country, and today's topic is one of particular importance to us, and we're excited to have a great panel for you today. Also joining me from LawRoom is Pax Haymeyer. Pax works on our instructional design team, helping develop courses and collaborate with clients to create customized training solutions. Pax has a PhD from UC Santa Barbara and spent many years as a teacher before joining us here in Walnut Creek, California. He will be helping facilitate the webinar, and I'm actually going to hand the mic over to him now, and he will introduce our presenters.
Thank you, Tanya, and thank you to everyone who is joining us via GoToWebinar today. We have a fantastic turnout. Diversity in tech, or the lack of it, has made a lot of headlines recently, but there hasn't always been the research to provide texture and depth to the discussion, and that's why we feel especially privileged to have Julie Oberweis and Monica Lees with us today. Julie, Monica, thank you for joining us today. As fellows at Stanford University Graduate School of Business, Julie and Monica have conducted dozens of interviews and surveyed more than 200 senior-level women in tech and venture capital fields. Through their research, they've uncovered some alarming patterns on the origins of gender discrimination in these industries, and they've discovered some possible solutions to this long-standing issue. You might have read their recent article in TechCrunch, Venture Capital's Next Venture, Women, Where Do We Go After Ellen Pao, which drew a lot of attention and really helped deepen the conversation, addressing some common misunderstandings about the lack of gender diversity in the tech industry. Today, they will be sharing some of their findings and insights with us. Julie and Monica's presentation will last about 40 minutes, finishing around 11:45 Pacific Standard Time. Monica and Julie are also welcome questions during their presentation. If you want to ask something, just type it into the question box in the GoToWebinar sidebar, and we'll address questions either during the presentation or at the end during the Q&A period. I also want to mention that Ashley Schway, who handles outreach and community engagement at LawRoom, will be live tweeting the webinar using the handle @LawRoomHR and the hashtag #ILookLikeAnEngineer. You can also direct questions to her there, and I believe she just tweeted the article from TechCrunch. Finally, you can also follow Julie and Monica at their Twitter handles, @JulieOberweis and @Monica Lees. And with that, I'll turn it over to Julie Oberweis and Monica Lees. Thank you both so much for being here with us today.
Thanks so much. We're excited to be here. This is Julie, and before we start, I want to tell a little story about the early days of a startup. A married couple had been jointly running a consulting company in Illinois for about 10 years. She was a strong, passionate, quick decision maker who viewed herself as a feminist. He was a thoughtful introvert who supported his wife's desire for a career and often reminded her and other women at their company to pursue her dreams. When they had an idea for a technology that would solve a major pain point for their client base, they grabbed a couple of programmers and began to build it. It didn't take long before the couple realized that this technology had real potential. Excitedly, they packed up their 3 kids and moved across the country to the promised land, Silicon Valley. The wife dutifully continued to run the consulting company in Illinois for about 3 years until it was acquired. She also continued to advise and sit on the board of the new California technology company. The husband found his calling as a product visionary, and the technology company thrived. It obtained $55 million in venture funding, hired 300+ employees, and has just achieved its spot on Fortune 500 fastest growing companies for the 2nd year running. But the real question is, how did it do on gender? Not so great, I'm sorry to report. Only 1 of the 7-person executive team is female. The engineering team is about 10% female. So the question is, how did a company started and run by a well-meaning male supportive of women with an overactive feminist board member still find itself with the same familiar fates of the technology world of Silicon Valley? This is what we're here to talk about today. Women are sorely underrepresented in Silicon Valley, in engineering roles as startup CEOs as venture capitalists. For example, they make up fewer than 6% of the decision makers at the future-facing and future-making table of venture vesting. Now, the story I just told you is near and dear to my heart because I am the board member that I described. This was very hard for me to watch and realize as the company grew up, but the reality was we didn't make gender a priority as we built the company. So one of my passions is writing our own ship, but also helping other companies as they go through some of the same trials and tribulations we did, figure out better ways to handle it. But fortunately for you and for me, I'm not here alone. I'm here with my classmate and team member, Monica Lees. Monica, do you want to spend just a couple seconds talking about why this topic is so important to you?
Absolutely. It's great to be here, everyone. Glad to have you on the line. My name is Monica, and I have come from a very different background from Julie. She's done a lot of technology and finance work, and I am from the creative world. My background's in journalism. I grew up at NBC News, went on to be a newspaper reporter. I came to business school last year, and after a career working for lots and lots of female bosses, having large female teams, I was struck, frankly, by the number of male panelists and male entrepreneurs who were speaking to me at Stanford Business School. And so as I kind of went through my first half of that year alongside Julie, this became a subject that was near and dear to my heart for a very different reason. I've been more of an outside observer to gender issues, and as I was experiencing and kind of getting swallowed up into the Silicon Valley infrastructure at Stanford, it became something that I wanted to explore further. And so that's where Julie and I kind of set off right at the beginning of last year, doing the research for what became that TechCrunch article. And then beyond that, we've done an additional survey that we'd like to talk to you a little bit more in depth about today. I want to fill you in on some of the research we've done. And before we do that, I just want to also let you know that we would love to hear from you in the question, with questions in the written questions. And I would love to, we really encourage your thoughts on all of this. We've been speaking to so many people in the Valley, but we obviously haven't spoken to everyone, and we think it's great to hear different voices and different experiences because we did get quite an array in our own research. A little bit more about the interviews we conducted. We focused initially on venture capitalists because we were intrigued, but the numbers in that area are actually far lower than anywhere else that we saw, and we're wanted to hear more from those folks, which was again the focus of that TechCrunch article. But from those initial conversations, we actually came across women who wanted to do even more research with us. And so we actually gained a few more partners in the process, sent out a survey, and more than 200 women from the Valley responded. More than 90% of them were from the Bay Area. Most of them, we really focused on women who were very experienced. More than 3/4 were older than 40 years old, had more than 10 years of experience in the tech industry. And what we heard from them were some striking similarities that we're going to talk to you about in a little bit. But what we believe we've done in this research is really the first truly analytical data analysis from women themselves who are in the industry. Nobody else that we know of has been able to collect firsthand information from the women who work and live and breathe this industry.
Particularly the senior level, what we feel as this data is particularly unique is the senior level of the respondents. So in putting this together, we worked a little bit with the Clayman Institute at Stanford, and that was really the piece that they were impressed and looking to expand upon. Go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, no, and so to kind of back up for a minute here, what we thought was kind of central to a lot of the research we've been doing is, why are these numbers so bad in the first place? And we kind of entered most of our conversation asking that question. And with that regard, we're actually putting up a quick poll question, curious to see if you think that the technology industry's reputation is fair or unfair. In your work environments, maybe you've got perfect gender balance, but we're curious to see how things look from your perspective. From our point of view, Julie and I believe that the reputation is what it is because it's true. Sadly, like I mentioned, it's an extremely low number for decision-making venture capitalists. The studies we've seen are anywhere from 4 to 6%. And then in terms of engineers, the latest studies we've seen on that are about 12% of engineers in the Valley are women. So there's a lot of room for improvement. We think the reputation is the reality. And, for the other kind of premise of the TechCrunch article is, these are the people deciding the future. Technology is the future, and, the lack of gender equality in this industry is problematic because to us it represents a future problem as well.
So first off, I just want to comment on the poll. We did complete the poll, and it looks like you guys agree with us that it's pretty accurate, about 70% accurate. 12% of you guys feel that it's overblown, and 16% understated. So we're about, majority are on the accurate side of things. So in thinking about this, when we first started this, we had, like we mentioned, we had interviewed venture capitalists. And what we found is that a lot of the venture capitalists kept saying, oh, it's a pipeline problem. And I remember one VC in particular looked at me in the eye and he said, Julie, you just got to be patient. This problem is going to solve itself. Women are going to, take up these majors in the STEM fields, and this problem in and of itself is going to solve it. And then we talked to, various women, and as we saw in our survey, we don't think it's a pipeline problem. We think that the problem is much more complicated and much more intricate than that. And that's really where we want to spend our time today. And we thought we'd start off with a pipeline because ultimately that's the answer that so many people come back to. And the fact of the matter is they're not wrong, right? I mean, a 2011 study by the U.S. Department of Commerce showed that 24% of STEM degrees were obtained by women. In contrast, women make up 48% of the entire economy. So it's not that the pipeline isn't a problem, it's just that it's not the only piece of the problem. And what we wanted to look at is what are the other pieces of the problem and how do they all come together to make this, for example, engineering at my own company at 10% female. How does that all come together?
And so with that, we think the pipeline is really deals with the first part of the issue, the hiring and recruitment part, about that really kind of obviously is the first step in bringing women into this field. But far bigger than that, in our belief, is the retention issue. And that's where a lot of our study numbers were focused, where once you're in the door as a woman, what is it like to work in the tech industry? What is it like to deal with sexual harassment? How much are you dealing with unconscious bias or discrimination? And how big of a factor are its family, and the fact that in some cases you might be the only woman in a boardroom. I know Mark Benioff, for example, himself was struck that he still is in board meetings with no women in the room. And I think that's the part of the puzzle. We talked about the pipeline and the hiring, but to us it's equally, if not more important, to focus on the retention issues and the experience for women once they're in place in the company. If we back up and talk a little bit more about that pipeline that so many people point to, I just want to underscore some of the details that we mentioned in the TechCrunch piece, and some details that highlight what makes Silicon Valley especially different from so many other industries. A lot of people might say, well, Wall Street has really bad numbers. It's true, they do have a disproportionately low number of women in that industry as well, but Silicon Valley is even lower. And so in our study, we found some things that might seem obvious now that once you go through them, but they're quite different from other types of industries. Namely, you're dealing with a lot of really small and private companies. There's no oversight. There are occasionally public boards if we're talking about large companies, but for the most part, the vast number of startups are run by small boards. There are no, federal regulations in a lot of cases, or public boards telling them what to do or how to hire people. And most importantly, in addition to kind of the structural issues with these small companies, we're dealing with a lot of similarity bias. And if you're in the HR world, I'm sure you're familiar with the concept that people tend to congregate and to assimilate and to join with the people who are like themselves. And we saw this time and again, and we heard this anecdotally from so many people, that founding teams tend to be built on classmates and the people who you lived with in your dorm. If founders of Facebook were Mark Zuckerberg's dorm buddies at Harvard. So many startups in the Valley start that way, as you well know. And so what can be done if we're looking specifically at the pipeline issue? What can be done to mix up those startup teams, to change things early on, to encourage girls and boys to work together in study groups, for example, and to fund founders who are diverse and different in their own right? So much of what we see, especially talking to VCs, obviously they trust people who have worked together before, and often the people who have worked together before tend to be a lot alike in and of themselves. So how do you break up those similarities at the very, very beginning of the startup process?
Yeah, I want to stop there for one quick second and just, when Monica and I think about this, we think that we don't have as much to add on and Monica mentioned this, to add on the recruiting piece of this, that's not really where our data or where we really focus our time. That having been said, I think the similarity bias piece is a big one. And I laughed a little bit. I was sitting in a class, and it was at Stanford. It was a women in entrepreneurship class. And they had a woman come into the class, and she was running a startup that was an HR tool to open up, that basically analyzed the recruiting process for gender biases. And she gave the example of a job description that was looking for a ninja engineer. And the funny thing was, as I was sitting in the class, I thought, oh, we don't do that. We're not finding women, but we don't do anything that would be a biased approach to recruiting. And then she mentioned this ninja engineer comment, which I had never thought of, that a woman wouldn't necessarily apply for a ninja engineering job posting. And there we were doing some of the exact same things. So I think that the piece is important. It's just not an area that we focused on. I think it's a piece to add to that.
And I think you're highlighting that there are subtle improvements to be made there, but all in all, making sure that the pipeline piece is not the only part of the puzzle. Yeah, is something that's important. I agree completely. And so with that, we'd like to move on to what we are calling the retention piece, which is, what is life like once a woman is in the door at a tech company? And as we mentioned before, these are some of the buckets that our research covered specifically. Julie, do you want to roll through these?
Sure. So, I think we'll get into each one of these more in depth, but we broke it down into 5 different pieces: sexual harassment, unconscious bias, exclusion, family factors, and by that we mean sort of social pressures, the additional social pressures that women get as it relates to family, especially taking care of children. And one is a lonely number. We've sort of hit on a little bit about regarding how do women navigate without necessarily mentoring of navigating some of the other pieces, such as the sexual harassment. We'll sort of get into each one of these a little more deeply. But with that, we wanted to toss one more poll at you guys. This is how do you find these various pieces impacting you at your company? In your roles, do you see these pieces? In which one really hits you the most? So that's what we're curious about there.
And just one more thing on these different factors as well. So much of what the conversation we started having early this year was based on the Ellen Powell case, as many of you may be familiar with. And that was a case that was really focused on the blatant sexual harassment piece. And I think what we tried to get at with our research is that there are so many other layers underneath the blatant sexual harassment, there's so many other different ways in which women might not feel welcome in the workforce. Super interesting results from that poll. 70% find that unconscious bias is the biggest indicator. 17% on lack of mentors, camaraderie. About even at 6% at exclusion and family factors, and 3% of sexual harassment. I'm super interested in this because part of Monica and my passion is around unconscious bias, because we truly believe that it is unconscious. But we were actually pretty surprised at what we saw on the sexual harassment. When we did the interviews of the venture capitalists, we found very little sexual harassment. Women didn't tell us stories that were, particularly alarming or scary. I mean, for those of you who read up on the women in venture capital, have probably read the Heidi Roizen piece on being, touched under the table 5 or 6 times in different news outlets, and that was really, we didn't see a whole lot of other stuff when we were interviewing the venture capitalists. And then we sent out our anonymous survey, and it was fascinating to me the number of the results we got there. And my intuition is that sexual harassment is actually more prevalent than we realize, and in a bad way, with some very unnerving stories. I'll get into a little bit right now. So the biggest thing that we saw is that sexual harassment was frequent. Can we go up? There we go. 2 in 3 women reported they'd been subject to unwanted sexual advances. 1 in 3 women had felt afraid for their personal safety because of work-related circumstances. To me, those numbers were really high. Now, I will back up for 20 seconds and say our survey was probably biased, right? We sent it out to as many women that we could with the 10-plus years of experience, but our intuition was and is that the women who filled out our survey probably had a experience that warranted their vested desire and time to fill out the survey. So biased survey, but still 2 in 3 women having unwanted sexual advances, and 1 in 3 personal safety. That was pretty big to me. Even more impactful for me was the fact that so many of the women filled out our open response boxes with stories that were mortifying. So we did a count. It's about 10 to 15% of women actually filled in stories that were unnerving. Things like a superior asked me to come to his hotel room on a work trip, and when I showed up, he was in a robe and there was nothing about work. There were other stories like a client asked me to sit on his lap in order to buy his products. I mean, they're not one of these is, oh my gosh, that's life-changing for my job. But as I think about how many of the stories came through and how inappropriate so many of the stories were, it was eye-opening for me, and I wondered about why the numbers are so low that we actually see. So the next brings us to the next slide, which is women aren't reporting harassment. So these women who are telling these stories in the survey are also telling us they didn't do anything. 48% did nothing. And 25% reported either to their superior, to HR, or took legal action. 17% spoke to the harasser directly, and 10% did other things, although most of the other things they filled in the boxes. Other things were one person went to law enforcement. So they were somewhat more in the reporting for most of those. So the question is, why aren't they reporting? And we've done a lot of thinking about this. And I actually shared this with a male colleague of mine, this data, and his response was, that seems insane. If these women are sexually harassed, why aren't they reporting? They should be reporting. And he actually knew about an incident that I had myself. I said, well, would you have had me, it was actually at Stanford, during Stanford, would you have had me report that? And his response was, of course not. There was nothing for you to gain from that. And I think that's the devil is in that detail, right? That
so many times the women don't have anything to gain by actually going through and reporting it, which actually brings to the next slide, which is why are these women not reporting harassment? So the majority of the women, we asked the women, why aren't they reporting the harassment? The majority of women said just wanted to forget about it. They didn't want to, move on. They wanted to move on with their lives. The next bucket of women said that they were worried about negatively impacting their career. And the last two groups were fairly even in the statistics, and they thought that it wouldn't make a difference, and they were embarrassed. So those are some of the really specific reasons as to why the women are not reporting harassment.
I think that's a really great summary of what we found. We were really surprised by these numbers when we first saw them. And the thing I would just underscore is that all of this is kind of amplified by some of those structural issues I mentioned earlier, right? So we're dealing with smaller companies, we're dealing with private companies, we're dealing with companies where everyone is very close and familial and cordial, and to report a harassment incident at a 12-person startup obviously changes the dynamic significantly, and can have an even bigger impact potentially on your career. And that, we think, makes this industry distinct in a lot of ways. So beyond the harassment that Julie talked about, we'll get into the unconscious bias, which, if we remember, the poll question was, you agreed with us that this was a really significant issue in your experience. We agree, and for us, this is where we get into the death by 1,000 paper cuts. And time and again, we didn't hear, when we were talking to VCs especially, we didn't hear about those egregious sexual harassment incidents, but we did hear about those really subtle, maybe demeaning comments. Could you have interpreted it the wrong way? Oh, I'm not sure. Is it worth saying anything about? What will be the repercussions if I say something? What if I'm just taking it wrong? Those sorts of really subtle points of discrimination is something that we talked about here. Julie, do you want to talk more about the numbers specifically around unconscious bias? To the slide specifically? Well, this is what I was just mentioning.
Right, and I think the numbers speak for themselves, but I think the big thing is sort of going through the buckets of the types of stories that we had.
Great.
So there were different areas that we saw in the subconscious bias. We put the bucket of, actually, if we go to the next slide here, the clients or colleagues not making the numbers. These three slides are actually pretty similar. So there's 8 and 10 women who responded that clients or colleagues make eye contact with my male peers but not me. So the types of stories we heard here were women who were very high-powered, walking into a room with their junior colleague, and the other people in the meeting looking towards the junior colleague, and the assumption being that that was based purely on gender. We saw that story multiple times. Now this story we actually heard multiple times in the venture capital interviews as well as in the survey respondents. This type of data was rampant. The next slide talks a little bit about where the questions are being addressed or who people are speaking to when in the room. And we saw this quite often, again, both in the interviews that we saw and in the survey respondents. And here, I should back up and say, not only are the questions being addressed, but also there was quite a few stories of women walking into a meeting and being, especially a board meeting or a pitch meeting for venture capitalists, where the other people in the room assumed that she was an administrative assistant. So we heard somebody got handed a coat just because she was in the room. One was a venture capital partner and a general partner, and she walked in and the startup asked her for a cup of coffee. That type of
discrimination happens frequently. And these women are mostly telling this to us with a laugh, right? Because here they are, very successful in their careers, very comfortable and confident with where they are. And so they're telling us this story with a laugh. But the problem is, what are you thinking? Well, what about the 22-year-old woman who just graduated with an engineering degree, making her way through it, who's going to get the very same treatment and have to make her way out of that? And so I think that's pieces of where we were coming in. And the other pieces of that, the stories, Mon, did I miss anything?
No, I mean, I think then you mentioned the good point that they said it with a laugh. I think, you know, there are so many other ways you could interpret it. And I think going back to the reporting thing, you know, are those tiny slights? Are those, you know, oh, you didn't make eye contact with me? That's nothing a woman would likely report, for example. And so I think that all feeds into the bigger issue of reporting and talking about this this issue in general. How do you figure out how to raise these unconscious bias issues without you know, shutting down the conversation entirely? That's something we're gonna talk about in a little bit.
The stories too. I want to hit on a couple more for you guys. One was we heard time and time again of women being characterized as too hot or too cold. I call them the too hot, too cold.
Goldilocks?
Yeah, the Goldilocks stories, right? Where a woman who's super strong and confident gets categorized as aggressive and abrasive, and the woman who is more in touch with people gets categorized as emotional or other stereotypical women characteristics, whereas a guy sitting next to her may not experience may experience very different labeling. So we heard those stories time and time again. And they're hard, by the way, because you know, there's usually some element of truth to them. So picking through what is gender discrimination and what's just reality is a hard and complicated piece. But we believe that when you see that in a mass scale statistically, that there is some bias there for sure. The other piece that I thought was very interesting bucket of stories was I call it the politics piece. And we heard pieces of this when we interviewed the venture capitalists. They talk about the fighting for credit, right? So in a venture capitalist world, the woman has to fight for credit in choosing, you know, finding her investments and, you know, approaching the coaching and all of the different pieces, and she's got to fight for the credit to get there. And the sentiment was that a lot of women don't want to bother with that. And how does that work? And by the way, when we saw this in the survey, it applied across the technology field in general, but we really got the in-depth stories from the venture capital world. And we even saw men who would tell us, hey, look, my wife wouldn't want to fight for that. She wouldn't be interested in the fight, the war zone that goes on to get the credit. She just wants to go do her job and go home. So, I mean, I think that's a piece of it. And what does it look like, or what's the perceptions that happen when women go out and fight for it? There's sometimes then they get labeled as, you know, too aggressive. Back to the Goldilocks. So those are some of the different types of stories that we saw in the survey, in both the survey and in the interviews.
And to take it a step beyond the unconscious bias, we put this into a different category. We put some of these other forms of discrimination into a category we called exclusion. And really these are a little bit more blatant in terms of things that women can point to and say, this happened to me, there's no question about it, I should have been on the ski trip, I should have been invited to this event, I asked to go and I was told it was for men only. That's kind of at the egregious end of the spectrum. Also the egregious end of the spectrum are, you know, having, you know, any kind of event at a strip club is obviously kind of an extreme exclusionary effort that we've heard about through our research. And then, I mean, even some more subtle things like planning parties, planning a frat-themed party at a workplace, things like that, where women might also feel excluded in a different way. And so our survey results turned back some pretty strong numbers there as well.
unfortunately. But I think it's a reality in terms of that general feeling of being excluded from business events, whether that's not going to the conference, not being invited to the meeting, and then 2/3 felt that on the specifically social or networking events, even more felt excluded in that environment. So we thought these numbers were quite striking as well.
Family life, my favorite. I'll share a personal side note here that I have 5 children. So this piece is near and dear to my heart as well.
The vast majority of the women we polled, 3/4 of them were mothers. So we got some great data there, knowing that they'd experienced family life.
Yeah. And I think the reality is the social pressures, we hinted at this earlier, the social pressures of the world put childcare more on a woman's back than a man's. And of course, that's family by family and individualized, but we saw those trends. And the other interesting piece of the data, I don't know the statistic off the top of my head, but a majority of the women that we polled, the successful technology women, were actually in superior roles to their partners. So we actually looked at that as well, and I thought that was fairly interesting. But we saw things like 40% feel the need to speak less about their family, to be taken more seriously. This was interesting. 53% took a shorter maternity leave than allowed. We saw stories time and time again about women fighting for their roles when they came back from maternity leave. We heard it from the venture capitalists. We heard women who lost deals or got cut out of meetings while on maternity. One woman was on maternity leave but wanted to be at the investment partner meetings, and if the partner meeting would get moved, and she wouldn't get included. We saw stories of women who came back and had lost their direct reports. We saw a story, one stuck out to me as a woman who had been on the elite top 1% of employees as sort of the bonus role for, it was the fast track, if you will, and she'd been on that for 4 years running, and when she came back from maternity leave, she was no longer on that. And so the maternity leave is a huge piece of the puzzle. 41% of the women surveyed said children negatively affected their careers. We actually thought that was an interesting one. I personally thought it would have been higher, and we put the statistic in there to share with you because we thought, there was maybe a silver lining there. 60% didn't think that they negatively affected their careers, and we talked a lot between Monica and I and some of our advisors about why that would be. And the mothers in the room decided it might be that we learned some management skills in trying to navigate that. So that one is an interesting statistic to us. So that's a little bit about family life. Okay.
This is just one more piece of the retention puzzle. I think it's the last one that we talk about on this list. And it's the simple fact that it's lonely out there, and if you're the first woman in the door, if you're the only one in the boardroom, if you've got no female mentors and there's no kind of female camaraderie in certain environments, it makes it challenging. I think instinctively this makes a lot of sense, and we can envision ourselves in these scenarios if we haven't been in them personally. And it's just another reason to think really hard about these sorts of issues and about changing them. And on the note of changing things, I know we're running short on time, wrapping up here shortly. I just wanted to run through a few examples of some innovative approaches that some companies in the area are trying. This is by no means comprehensive and really just kind of a smattering of opportunities. And I think some things that have gotten some recent press. The Rooney Rule is getting rolled out according to press reports at Pinterest, Facebook, maybe elsewhere. The rule is really tied to recruiting and the concept that you need to, you set in place a rule that you're going to make sure you have diverse candidates for every single role that you put out. and that your search is not complete until you find those diverse candidates. I should mention as a side note that we've been focusing a lot on gender issues. There are obviously so many other diversity issues that we did not get into, but those are equally important in my mind. And so that's where the Rooney Rule might apply, and do, who knows, do some good on the recruiting side. Closely related to that are diversity targets. Some call them quotas. You probably heard Benioff's Salesforce announcement that he wants to have 50% of his workforce be women in the next decade. Pinterest has some similar targets that they're putting forth on their engineering team and other areas where they're underrepresented, where women are underrepresented. Reddit, when Ellen Powell was in charge, I haven't seen the latest reporting on this, but I know when Ellen Powell was there, they were talking about instituting policies where there would be no negotiation allowed of any salaries at any time across the board. There's been a lot of study that women choose often not to negotiate their own salaries as well as they should or could. And so this is seen by some as an effort to kind of even that playing field. It's a little bit more controversial, but it's out there on the table. And then lastly, there's also kind of on the recruiting, but possibly retention as well, hackathons or any other kind of efforts that bring in, that are specifically targeted to bring in diverse candidates into a company, to experience the culture, to get a handle on what life is like there, and to really expose them to the opportunities in different parts of the tech industry. Those are becoming increasingly popular from what I've seen and heard in the area. So wanted to put those out there, and curious, we're sending out a poll now, curious if your companies have tried any of those ideas. Certainly would love to hear from you in the comments if you've seen any success with any of those, or if you've got any others that we did not have on the list. I'd love to hear your take on them. And so with that, we wanted to kind of leave off with some general thoughts on what we think some solutions might be in the future.
I think the obvious one is talking about it. You know, the fact that we're all here today talking about it has to be a good sign. If we get the word out with data like we have seen, and everyone is aware of what's happening. I want to share one story that we heard from a female venture capitalist in our interviews. And she said she went on maternity leave and she came back, and she stopped getting any invitations to meetings after 5 o'clock. She thought this was curious, so finally she asked. She said, why am I not invited to any of these meetings? And her well-meaning male partners said, we knew you want to get home to your family. And they weren't wrong. She did want to get home to her family, but she certainly didn't want to miss important meetings either. And it was very important for all the partners in the room to have that discussion, to understand where she was at, and that she wanted to be a part of that, and for them to know that she didn't feel like they were imposing upon her by asking her to be at a meeting after 5 o'clock. And for me, that very much highlighted the fact that we need to talk about it. We need to put the various players in the room and have discussions, and not make this an elephant, not make this awkward or inappropriate to discuss. Hey, look, we know you have kids and you might want to get home to your kids, but we also know you take your job seriously. And by the way, as a dad in the room, also want to get home to my kids. And so how do we make this work for everybody involved?
And to that point, it's the last one on this list, but it goes in line with making sure that men and women are included in the conversation. Obviously, lots of male allies out there who want to see this sort of equality and representation for women in the workplace. How do we encourage their voices at the table? I think making sure that those sorts of conversations are not shot down, but are rather encouraged in the process, and that it's okay to bring these things up without having your hands slapped or being shunned in any way. And we're seeing some male CEOs take that lead, and then I think it's a matter of making sure that initiative really trickles down at every level. And that speaks to the second bullet on this list, which is, implement the change across the board. We've heard some criticism of, organizations that have diversity HR leads. I don't have a strong opinion either way on that, except to say, one person in the HR department, preaching about these issues is not going to make the change. It's really about making every single leader in the company an advocate for diversity, and making sure that they themselves think through and are aware of things like unconscious bias, understanding what that means. In addition to blatant sexual harassment, here's what it could mean to exclude someone. Here's what happens. Here's some subtle examples of discrimination that you may or may not be aware of. Making sure that your managers at all levels are aware of these sorts of things, we think is an important step as we look forward to what can be done in different types of companies across the board. And with that,
I think we turn to questions.
Sure.
I have one question that I'm looking through the questions now, but the one question was regarding how many women are studying technologies at the universities. I don't know that specifically, but what I do have it, and I mentioned this earlier, is that about 24%, the 2011 study done by U.S. Department of Commerce showed that 24% of STEM, which is science, technology, engineering, and math, degrees were obtained by women. So that might give a bit of an answer to that question. Just looking to see if there's any other questions here.
This is Pax. We had a few others come in, and one question that came up was if you could talk a little bit about what you think some of the far-reaching consequences might be if the tech industry doesn't address its lack of diversity.
There are lots of studies on this. I mean, in terms of we've seen the studies of having women on boards. Some of that research is a little controversial about whether those companies are actually more successful or not. Have you seen any updated numbers on? We dug up an old report on that. I'm trying to remember what the number was.
I don't remember, but there's done a lot of studies on the difference because it's so concrete. There were some studies done on the difference between board members with women versus board members without women. But we would argue. So one of the points that we believe is that Silicon Valley is so impactful on the world in and of itself, right? And so if technology, if our world isn't incorporating women's thoughts and perspectives, that women lose all over the world, right? Because it's sort of the future making aspect of the world. Fortunately we're all in Silicon Valley, so I'm well aware of how biased I am that this is the place of the future. But our belief is that not only is Silicon Valley behind other industries, to be clear, right, sexual discrimination happens in almost all industries on one way or another, but Silicon Valley is at the highlight of it, partly because our numbers are worse. We did some research we thought, oh, it can't be any worse than Wall Street. Clearly Wall Street has to have been a worse environment than tech companies.
Right.
And we didn't come across that as our conclusion. It was a little inconclusive on the statistics and the data, and how do you define decision making in different areas, and it was less than clean to present. But what I can say is that, boy, Wall Street has a bad reputation, and I think tech companies are probably worse.
Any other last questions?
We have one more that just came in. I'm just going to read it off the question board. So, a lot of small startup companies cannot afford the women who are viable candidates because they are in so much demand. So we can't compete with salary offers from Facebook, Google, etc. And so how can we attract more female candidates?
It's a great question, and certainly a real challenge. I think getting creative on some of these fronts. I mentioned the hackathons, or getting creative about how you promote yourself as something different, and offering, if it's appropriate, leadership opportunities for those women in ways that they might not, receive that sort of promotion or autonomy in a Facebook or a Google. I think those are, as a woman, those are some things that would appeal to me. I don't know that we looked at that in detail, but I think that's an important issue to raise, that it can be really tough for the smaller companies. On the flip side, the argument is obvious to make that you would have a lot more authority and just ownership over one of those small companies if you were coming on board as a woman.
and creating an environment that's attractive for women, right? And this goes back to some of the things that we've hit on, you know, the willingness to discuss the elephant in the room, the willingness to make it a comfortable environment, to not allow, well, certainly not allow sexual harassment, but also really to take up subconscious bias. I don't think companies are really attacking subconscious bias in a systematic way. And I think that might be an innovative way to approach the problem.
Also bringing that, you know, the women candidates in that scenario into the fold in terms of your discussions on how to fix things, give her a voice at the table for selecting the next female hires at your company, potentially. I'm just throwing out ideas of how to get women involved in that process.
So we also have a question about tech companies implementing paid maternity leave. Have you seen that in your research, and can you comment on it?
Well, we obviously saw the news about the extended maternity leaves that are now unfolding at Adobe and Netflix. I think, you know, I think it's way too early to see how that will impact, you know, how things change, if things change in the Valley. Do you have an opinion on it, Julie?
My opinion is that it's tricky. So this is not necessarily from, you know, depths of research here, but you know, we saw 53% aren't taking the maternity leave that's sitting there. So expanding that, what is it? What are we really doing? I mean, if I had my druthers, I would make a world where it was socially acceptable and, in fact, socially expected for men and women to equally care for their children, right? And then if men are taking paternity leaves in order to spend time with their children, it becomes less of a taboo, right? And is there a way to do that at an individual company level? Boy, I sure don't know how to really manage that. I'm not saying that I do or that that's an easy problem, and I can, you know, I'm not advocating for it to do that at our company. But if there was a way to create a world where men and women were taking care of their children equally, I think that would really promote diversity in the workplace. Not really an easy answer.
It's about 11:55 right now. We want to be respectful of everyone's time, and so we want to thank everyone for attending today. It's been a great learning experience for us at LawRoom, and I hope it was for everyone who sat in as well. And I want to, of course, especially thank Julie and Monica. Thank you so much for being here and for your participation.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Of course, and we hope you'll join us again in the future. Before we sign off, let me pass the controls back to Tanya to discuss next steps.
Thank you, Pax, and thank you again, Julie and Monica, for a wonderful presentation. I think the number of people attending today's webinar indicates just how important these issues are and will continue to be, not just for the tech industry, but for all companies that are committed to building a diverse culture. As an employee training company, diversity and discrimination are topics core to our business here at LawRoom, and we're proud to be delivering training solutions to many of the most well-known and fastest growing tech companies. If anyone on the webinar today is interested in scheduling a demo to see how we're working with other tech companies, we're happy to set one up. You can just type demo into the chat or question box, and we'll follow up with you directly. Also, we'd very much like to continue the conversation that we started with Julie and Monica today and learn more about how your organizations actually are addressing these complex issues. Later this week, we'll be reaching out with a few questions just to better understand how these issues are affecting your organization and what goals and initiatives you're putting in place to improve diversity in tech. Thank you again, Julie and Monica. We'll have a full recording of today's webinar to all of the attendees by tomorrow, and then along with other additional resources that were discussed during the webinar today. If you have any additional questions at all, please email me directly at t.fabianek@lawroom.com. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.